Good day. As most of you no doubt know, 2 days ago, the President of China, Xi Jinping, and the President of the United States had a virtual meeting with each other, which I discussed and covered extensively in a very lengthy video, which I posted on this channel. It is, in fact, the lengthiest video I have ever made for this channel, and which I researched very carefully prior to making it. When I say I researched it, I should say that I read the readouts published by the two governments, and I also read the briefing documents published by the United States. These are the commentaries of setting out the discussions that US senior administration officials have with the media directly after the talks, and which have been published on the White House website. I also looked at the Chinese media, and I looked at what the various Chinese news agencies, Xinhua, Global Times, China Daily, and all the rest had to say. And I gave what I thought was a thorough and complete account of what had been discussed and what the discussions had been at the summit meeting between Biden and Xi. So you can imagine my astonishment when the following day I read in the Financial Times an article which in fact appeared on the very front page. It was the leading article, which said that the US and China agreed to hold talks on nuclear arsenals. And then the subtitle goes on to say, breakthrough came during Monday's virtual summit meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. And this really did come as a great surprise to me, because firstly, I'd seen no hint of anything about such talks in the various readouts or statements or commentaries which the two countries have published about the virtual summit meeting. And I would certainly have noticed such a thing and had such a breakthrough agreement to hold negotiations about nuclear arsenals between China and the United States actually taken place. I should say that the Chinese, up to this moment in time, have consistently refused to talk with the United States about their strategic nuclear deterrent force. They say that this is not a topic that they're prepared to discuss with the United States, or at least they're not prepared to negotiate about it with the United States. And having talks on nuclear arsenals would be indeed a radical shift in Chinese policy, something which one would have expected would be announced and explained very carefully by the Chinese government if it had actually taken place. And then further down in the article, I read that the two sides did not decide on the format for the talks. Notice the word format. And the US wants to see if China will follow through on the pledge from Xi. Notice the use of the words pledge. So if we're to believe the Financial Times, over the course of the discussion between Biden and Xi, Xi gave Biden a pledge, a promise, in other words, that China would reverse its long-standing policy and would agree to hold talks with the United States about its strategic nuclear arsenal. Now, as I said, I found that astonishing. There was nothing, no hint of anything like that in any of the documents about the summit published by the two governments. But the Financial Times, which used to be a newspaper of record, attributed these comments to the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. It cited him as an authority, as a source for the fact that these talks, that this promise from Xi to hold these talks had actually taken place. Anyway, after reading this article, this in the Financial Times, I rechecked all of the various places, all the various commentaries published by the two governments, by the US government and by the Chinese government directly after the summit took place, and I could find no mention of any agreement to hold talks of that nature at all. The only comment about it that I could find, the only official comment, came in the daily briefing of the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, Zhao Lijian, which took place on the day after the Financial Times published this article. And the comment was made in response to a question from Reuters. And the question from Reuters reads as follows. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that during the BITCHUTE meeting, China agreed to work with the United States on nuclear arms treaty. Can you confirm this? And Zhao Lijian responded, I don't have any information on top of the readout of the virtual meeting that was published by the Chinese side. And can I say that that readout, as I've said previously, makes no reference whatsoever to such talks. So that didn't seem to be a confirmation from the Chinese of any such agreement to hold talks. On the contrary, it seemed, if anything, to deny that there was any agreement to hold talks. Anyway, it's always possible that something has been agreed and that the two governments have decided to keep it private between themselves, and that Jake Sullivan blurted out something to that effect in some format or other. And in fact, the Financial Times says that he said this during a webinar at the Brookings Institution in Washington. So I went and I found the transcript of his comments, and this is what Jake Sullivan actually said. And it was in response again to a question from an American military officer, or retired military officer, General Allen. And General Allen asked Jake Sullivan questions about security relations between the United States and China. And over the course of his question, he made these comments. This is General Allen. The Chinese are very clearly working through emerging technologies, particularly in tech, cyber domain, and hypersonics. And of course, the recent test of the fractional orbital bombardment system, that's the reference to the hypersonic glide vehicle test. Was there a discussion at all on how China and the United States can come together to address these issues? Because arms control, as we have traditionally known it, is much bigger now as an issue, and it spreads across the domains as well. And we are really the only two countries that have those kinds of capabilities. Was this a matter of discussion? And this will be your last answer, Jake. And then Sullivan responded, John, it's a great question. These are sensitive and consequential issues that matter profoundly for America's national security. And how we effectively manage them with China, as how we effectively manage them with Russia, will be determinative of whether we are succeeding in stewarding this policy effectively or not. So without going into too much detail on incredibly sensitive issues, President Biden did raise with President Xi the need for a strategic stability set of conversations around the sort of issues you just described. That needs to be guided by the leaders and led by senior empowered teams on both sides that cut across security, technology, and diplomacy. And the two leaders agreed that we should look to begin to carry forward discussions on strategic stability. Now, that is not the same as what we have in the Russian context, with the formal strategic stability dialogue that is far more mature, has a much deeper history to it. There is less maturity to that in the US-China relationship. But the two leaders did discuss these issues. And it is now incumbent on us to think about the most productive way to carry it forward from here. So that doesn't seem like a statement that the Chinese have agreed to enter talks about strategic arsenals, which is what the Financial Times says. Rather, it seems to be a confirmation from Jake Sullivan that the Chinese and the Americans talk about all the various issues that concern each other, that they're going to be working parties and groups of officials. There always are, by the way, and that those sort of topics will be discussed, but clearly there's nothing there about talks of any kind. And certainly there's no reference in these actually rather opaque words of Jake Sullivan. There's nothing there that suggests any kind of pledge by Xi Jinping or promise by Xi Jinping to hold talks about nuclear arsenals. So that does beg a number of questions, because it does make one wonder whether someone at the Financial Times is reading more into these words of Jake Sullivan than appear to be there. Well, I think we can now definitely say that in fact the Financial Times did read more into these words than Jake Sullivan actually meant them to mean, because we now have a formal Chinese denial, or at least a Chinese denial, perhaps not exactly formal, but a Chinese denial, and it takes the form, as it so often does nowadays, in the form of an editorial in Global Times. And the Global Times editorial begins, US cannot dictate to China on nuclear arms control talks. That's a very interesting choice of words for the title to the editorial, by the way. Notice the word US cannot dictate to China. We'll come to that in a moment. Anyway, the editorial then goes on to say the following. Discussions about China's nuclear power have again emerged in Washington in the past 2 days. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan claimed that during the virtual summit between the Chinese and US heads of state, the two sides agreed to look to begin to carry forward discussions on strategic stability. But he did not spell out what such discussions would be and when they might be held. John Hyten, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, also made a sensational remark in an interview, saying the Chinese could one day have the capability to launch a surprise nuclear attack on the United States. He was referring to China's ability brought by the reported test of a hypersonic weapon. And that's not all. Discussions on strategic stability used to refer to nuclear arms control talks. Yet in recent years, new categories such as cyber, space, and hypersonic weapons have been added to the concept. Its connotation has expanded. The readout of the Chinese side on the China-US virtual summit did not touch on discussions on strategic stability, nor did the US's official readout. It can thus be concluded that the leaders of the two countries must not have reached a clear conclusion on this issue, which so far remains vague. The US strongly wants to draw China into nuclear arms control negotiations. During Donald Trump's presidency, Washington wanted Beijing to join the US-Russian arms control talks, but China refused. The nuclear deterrence of China is not on the same level as that of the United States and Russia. China's attitude has strong moral and reality bases, and the United States cannot exert any coercive force. This year, the United States has been continuously claiming that China has built multiple nuclear missile silos based on commercial satellite images, claiming China's nuclear expansion is suffocating. The Pentagon's report on China's military, issued last month, predicts that China could have 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. The hype, combined with the so-called hypersonic missile test, which is not officially confirmed by China, have created an unprecedented atmosphere of panic towards the development of China's nuclear deterrence. US media quickly amplified the vague information from Sullivan and claimed it was one of the few specific items announced so far that the two sides would need to follow up on during the virtual summit. They did it on purpose, hoping to promote public opinion pressure to make China accept that it is already a fait accompli. Nuclear arms control discussions have been listed in the China-US agenda. An anonymous Chinese official told a foreign media outlet that discussions on nuclear arms control between China and the US could first be carried out through scholars, or what is commonly referred to as Track 2 talks. Global Times has learnt that there have been many Track 2 talks between China and the US on the nuclear issue. We noted that some Western scholars have expressed doubts about the possibility of China and the US holding talks on nuclear arms control in the near future. The reason is that China and the US have deep distrust in each other on strategic issues, and the gap between the size of their nuclear deterrence is so wide that they do not believe China has the impetus to do so. Global Times believes that conditions for China and the US to carry out Track 1 nuclear arms control talks, referring to the talks between the functional departments of the two countries, are not yet available. The US hopes that its absolute nuclear superiority over China will be solidified thoroughly and will take it as the ultimate bargaining chip to put strategic pressure on China. Its anxiety over China's nuclear deterrence reflects its zero-sum mentality in its China policy. The US has been increasing its sense of urgency for dynamic assessment of China's minimum nuclear force needed to maintain security. China has no intention to engage in a nuclear arms race with the United States. What we need to establish is a fully effective nuclear deterrence to exclude the possibility of the US exercising nuclear blackmail against China at a critical moment. Tensions are high across the Taiwan Straits. The Taiwanese Authority is crazily rejecting reunification by force and seeking independence by relying on the US. There is a serious possibility of a war across the Taiwan Straits, and the US has been implying a possible military intervention from time to time. Several recent literary deductions on the China-US conflict have predicted that the US would be the first to launch a nuclear attack on China. The US must reduce the strategic threat it imposes on China, excluding the possibility of imposing military pressure during process of Chinese mainland solving the Taiwan question. It must make sure that it will not take extreme action to interrupt the development of China, so Chinese society can clearly see that the hostility from the United States towards China is decreasing. These are all preconditions for the United States to have nuclear arms control talks with China. When the Taiwan question is resolved and the United States truly accepts China's rise, instead of threatening China's core interests, China's strategic need to strengthen national security through increased nuclear deterrence would be greatly reduced. Having talks on nuclear security requires efforts in multiple directions. So what the Chinese are saying is that this is not just fake news, that China never agreed to strategic nuclear arms talks with the United States, but that this is fake news peddled by the US administration itself. They've tried to imply, to spread the story, that there was a promise by China to enter into nuclear arms talks at the virtual summit between Biden and Xi in order to exert pressure on China to go ahead with such nuclear arms talks. But the Chinese will not be dictated to in that kind of way. They have no interest in entering into nuclear arms talks with the United States at this time. And there is no possibility of such nuclear arms talks taking place until the key issues that cause tension between China and the United States, and which might potentially lead to a conflict between those two countries, namely, first and foremost, the issue of Taiwan, is resolved. Now, I am absolutely sure that this is correct. I'm absolutely sure that Jake Sullivan made those comments at Brookings with a full intention that they would be relayed around the media and made to sound like some kind of pledge by the Chinese, by Xi Jinping himself, to hold nuclear arms talks. And as I've said, no such pledge was given and no such promise was made. I think the Chinese are going to be extremely angry that this trick was played upon them. And in fact, one gets some of the sense of that anger from this Global Times editorial. Note how the Global Times editorial actually all but accuses the United States of orchestrating this story in order to try to maneuver China into a situation where it feels it must enter into negotiations, which it is not at this moment ready to do. And the Chinese clearly are extremely annoyed about this, and it is something that they will remember when they have future discussions with the US on similar sort of issues. To my mind, what this episode shows, yet again, is what a difficult partner the United States is when another country, in this case China, tries to enter into negotiations with it. Quite probably, Xi Jinping agreed with Biden, yet yes, their officials, their people will have discussions about a range of different matters. I mean, this, as Global Times says, has already been happening. It goes on all the time. But certainly Xi Jinping never intended to make any kind of pledge that there should be talks about nuclear weapons. No such pledge was made. Yet Jake Sullivan spuns this agreement to continue discussions of the sort that go on all the time between great powers like China and the United States, and which, by the way, also continue between China, Russia and the United States also. He tried to spin this to give the impression that nuclear arms talks might be pending, even though his actual words at the webinar at the Brookings Institution were couched with that vagueness which made it easy to carry out an exercise in deniability. But it's clear that afterwards, administration officials, quite possibly Sullivan himself, fanned out across the media, referred back to his comments at Brookings in order to make it seem that Xi Jinping had made this pledge to enter into nuclear arms talks. The intention being, as I said, to increase the pressure on Xi Jinping to enter into nuclear arms talks and to imply that he has broken his promise to enter into nuclear arms talks if he doesn't do so. Well, all this is going to do is sow further distrust between China and the United States. It's going to make it even more difficult in future for negotiations on substantive issues, real negotiations, to take place. Because the Chinese will say to themselves, if what we say in a discussion, especially a discussion between our two leaders, our leader, the president of our country, and the president of the United States, if it can be distorted by the American side in such a way, well, how can we trust and talk with the Americans about anything? It is, if I may say so, schoolboy tactics, the kind of foolishness that might look like it's clever, but is actually, on the contrary, extremely stupid. Now, who exactly came up with this idea? I'm not sure, and perhaps I'm doing Jake Sullivan an injustice when I see that he might have been involved in this episode. But whoever it was has done real harm, and he's made, or she's made, the process of negotiation between China and the United States even more difficult than it might once have been. The Russians have taken in recent years to saying that the United States has become agreement incapable, that the United States has become so untrustworthy in negotiations and is so willing to break agreements that it has reached, that there is really no point in negotiating with it on any substantive issue. And it's undoubtedly the case that this is severely complicating discussions between the Americans and the Russians at the present time. This incident makes me fear that Chinese-US relations are heading the same way. Before very long, I would not be surprised if the Chinese start saying that the US is agreement incapable also. Given how important the China-US relationship is for the world, that will be a dark day when it happens. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me on future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to join us on our other platforms, most especially on Locals, where we now have a thriving community which you can join and where you can follow our videos and our programs, and also join me on my live streams. And we're also active on a multiplicity of other platforms, including BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, and SuperU. And you can support us by coming to Patreon and Subscribestar, and by buying the amazing things that you will find from our shop, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And you can also support us and this channel by checking your subscription to this channel, and also by ticking the like button to this video. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.